Hey, it's Jared. In this video, I'm going to compare the Leica Q343 to the Sony A1. Now, just a quick backstory on both of these cameras. First of all, with the Sony A1, I've been shooting on this camera professionally since it first came out. So I've had this camera for a few years and it has been through everything with me. It's my go-to camera, it's my workhorse, and I've had many lenses on this camera. I've shot many hours is an understatement, of video and shot tens of thousands, I'm sure, at least of photos. I don't even know how many photos I've shot with this. So many photos. Now, with the Q343, this is the second Leica that I have had. I purchased the Q3 earlier this year because I desired to have a camera that I could grab and just go and shoot for the enjoyment of photography. This is my workhorse, and I have a variety of other Sony cameras that I use, and I find myself wanting to rely on being able to switch lenses and have all the options, because with a mirrorless camera that has removable lenses like an SLR style, it's tempting to get lenses, to get all the options, and to have the flexibility to do whatever you want. And so my desire with the Leica was that it had a fixed focal length and it would force me to get more creative, to be more connected to the images that I'm capturing. And initially, that was my experience with the Q3. Now, the Q3, in my opinion, for the type of photography that I find myself doing, was just a little wide. The 28mm lens, a beautiful lens capturing amazing images. And yes, it did have crop in mode so that I could turn that 28 into a 35 or like a 50, all the way up to a 90mm. But that just wasn't the experience that I wanted. I wanted to shoot at the native focal length of the lens and not try to make the Leica what I had made my Sony cameras. However, the 28mm was a little wide for me when I'd try to shoot a portrait. Too wide when I'd try to shoot some architecture, some buildings, some landscapes or whatever. I just felt like it was too wide. Everything was just too small in the background. So when the Leica Q343 came out, I thought, well, 43mm, that is a bit further down the range, not a lot. So it's not so telephoto that I'm going to miss out on the ability to use it for landscapes. But it's not so wide that everything in the background is going to look so tiny. So I thought, let's give it another go with Leica and shoot with the Leica. And I have to say, I have absolutely enjoyed the 43mm. And then, of course, having all the way up to 150mm with the crop feature means that if I do need to get in close for something, I have the ability to do that. Like I said before, I don't want to rely on that. I want to shoot at the native focal length of the camera, but knowing that I have that as a backup, even though it'll be a lower resolution image, that's fine, but it's an option. So let's talk about my experiences, because yes, the Leica is connecting me more to my photography. I'm spending more time just enjoying photography for the sake of enjoying it. But I could easily do that with this camera. It's all a mindset thing, and I've identified that. I identified it in the video that I made about the Leica Q343, and I'm still understanding that now, that it is a mindset thing. This is a tool, and essentially they accomplish the same exact thing. So this video isn't so much going to be about what's the best camera for me, because I already have the best camera. I have one of the best cameras on the market for the money, and I have a ton of G Master lenses and all the great options that are there. So it's not going to be a conversation about why I just wasn't shooting for the enjoyment of shooting with this camera. It's not about the gear. So this video is going to be about what's the better camera for capturing about that focal length. So 43mm, obviously Sony doesn't make a 43mm, but they make a 35mm, and then there's also this 40mm G lens. Then of course we have a 50mm as well. And so I spent a lot of time taking very similar images with both of these cameras, with sometimes the 35mm, sometimes the 40mm, but I tried to stick mostly with the 40mm because it was the closest in focal length to the Leica Q343. Now, to compare these two lenses, this Leica lens is a high quality, top-notch Leica lens. Like, there's not much better than the lens that comes on this camera. This is a Sony G lens, which is kind of a middle of the road lens. The G Master is top notch. And then, of course, they have just their regular lenses, which I guess are G lenses as well, but they're lower level lenses. But this is a FE 2.5, so it's full frame. 2.5 is the widest aperture, and it's a 40 millimeter. Now, this Zeiss lens is 43 millimeter, but it has a widest aperture of f2. Now, this only goes to an f16, so you can only stop down to f16, whereas this lens stops all the way down to f22, which is quite a bit further. So this will come a little bit into play as we look at some of the images and talk a bit about some of the images that I captured. So before we look at the images, let's just talk about overall experience with the cameras. First, let's talk about the camera bodies. Obviously, the Sony A1 is significantly larger, and yes, I do have a plate on the bottom of this camera that's adding to the size of the camera. So if we look at these cameras kind of side by side here, so let's look at them. They're not really that different in size. I just kind of have some things adapted to my A1 that makes it a bit bigger. So when you look at the body, they're about the same height. I would say maybe even the Leica is just a smidge taller. But then if you factor in the raised area for the EVF on the Sony and the knobs, the Sony ends up being a little bit taller. But as far as the core portion of the body itself, the Leica is a little bit bigger. Now, if we look at these cameras kind of side by side, keeping in mind that I do have some things adapted to the Sony, you can see that the Leica is a bit thinner than the Sony. The Sony is a bit thicker than the Leica, and that's all right. And then when we look at the lens, obviously this is a G Master lens. It's 35 millimeter. It's quite a bit bigger. But if I then switch out the 35 millimeter for the 40 millimeter to get as close as I possibly can in focal length to the Leica Q343, then we have a smaller lens on the Sony. And really, this lens is only as large as it is because of the lens hood on it. That lens is pretty small. It's maybe the width or the length of two pancake lenses. So really small in comparison. So it makes it a bit smaller. So when it comes to overall weight of both of these cameras, obviously the Sony feels a little bit heavier in my hand because it's got this bracket on the bottom of it. But if I didn't have that on the bottom, they probably would feel about the same weight. I'm not 100% sure what the weight difference is between these two. I only have a tiny little scale here that I can use to weigh small things. I don't have a scale that I could use to weigh these cameras, but in the hand, they both feel pretty much the same. Now, the Leica is surprisingly heavy because it's just a solid chunk. I mean, this camera is built tough and it is a solid chunk of a camera. And the Sony is relatively solid as well, but it doesn't feel like a big piece of aluminum like the Leica does. And so the Leica, very solid, very heavy in comparison to most cameras its size. Now, as far as the handling of these cameras, obviously the Sony has a nice big grip on it, and it's designed for long-term use, holding this in your hand and having a good grip on the camera, whereas the Leica is more designed for minimal, probably short-term shooting. And I did add the grip to it just because having a rest for the thumb there makes it a lot easier for me to hold this camera and feel secure with it, especially when you're taking those shots maybe one-handed and you're moving and you just don't have a great way to stabilize the camera. Having the thumb grip there definitely helps. But the Leica doesn't give you nearly as much to hold on to. And that's okay. This camera is not meant to be just used constantly throughout the day. This is not a camera, in my opinion, that is a workhorse camera. You're going to be shooting hundreds or thousands of images in a day. This is a camera which you pull out and grab a nice frame of something that's taking place, a thoughtful frame. Whereas this Sony camera is for things that are happening faster, where you need faster shooting modes and you need the ability to hold on to the camera for long periods of time because you're shooting longer events, different things like that. They're built for two different things, two different experiences overall. One thing that the Leica doesn't have a lot of is on-camera controls. On the top of the camera here, we have adjustment for shutter speed, which has taken a bit of time for me to get used to because I'm just not used to having a dial for shutter speed. Of course, back in the day, you definitely adjusted your shutter speed in this way on film cameras, but in the digital era, we just don't have the shutter speed on a dial like this, so it's taken a little bit of getting used to for me. So there's a dial right here that also adjusts the shutter speed and also the ISO. I do have the camera in automatic as far as the aperture. You can manually or automatically adjust the aperture using the ring. But on this dial of the camera, when we rotate it, we're adjusting the shutter speed. So not only can you adjust the shutter speed here, but you can adjust the shutter speed here. And that's by default. Of course, I could change what these do. I could change the rotation of this to something else, but if you press in the button, then we have the ability to rotate and change the ISO on the camera also. So it's taken a little bit of getting used to with the camera controls. We then have a dial right here, which we can push and move the focus point around, and then we can press in the center button to get different display features. We have a playback and a menu button. And then we have an articulating display, which I have found is a bit challenging to get out compared to the articulating display on the Sony. When I am trying to get this out, I have to grip the camera and dig my fingers underneath. It's really hard to try and get the screen open by gripping it from the side, which is just something that I've been used to with the Sony. So you have to grip it from the bottom and the top and slide this out. And of course, it doesn't flip around. It doesn't have a feature for that, nor does the A1. The A1 has an articulating display, but it's much easier to get that display out. It doesn't flip around like some of the newer Sony cameras that have both a flip-up display and one that articulates around so that you can view from the front of the camera. Now, there's a lot more switches and buttons on the A1. We have our mode dial here. We have exposure compensation. We can adjust our shutter speed here. We can adjust our aperture up front. We have a dial for adjusting our ISO as well as multiple other things. We have a dial over here for camera modes, for focus modes. So there's tons of dials on this camera. And I find that having these additional dials for me allows me to more easily get through different features of the camera to get the camera's features out of the way so that I can shoot photos. It's very easy for me to make adjustments to shutter speed and aperture as a person who shoots in full manual mode and rarely goes into any other mode other than manual mode. I like having those dials available. On the Leica, however, if you want to be a full manual shooter, which means controlling your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, it takes a bit more thinking about things. First of all, you have to adjust your aperture manually on the lens, which is just something I am not used to doing. I do have Sony lenses that have that option, but I just simply don't use it. I use the adjustment on the back of the camera. Now, I also am used to a dial for the shutter speed. I don't change my shutter speed that often, but having a clickable dial like this is just something I'm not used to. So I find myself using the dial here to adjust the shutter speed, which means that whatever number I have selected here is not valid. It's not what's selected because what I have done is overridden that. And in order to get this dial to be correct again, I have to turn this dial to whatever shutter speed I had set the camera to. And then for ISO, I have to press down the button and then rotate the dial that way. Now, what I would eventually do is change ISO just to the rotation of this dial, so I don't have to press in the button for that. And then change it so when I press in the button and rotate the dial, so I'd probably just flip them so that ISO is always ready to go. That would force me to use this dial for shutter speed instead. And then I would just have to get used to using the ring on the lens for aperture. And all of that to say, with some practice, I'd get faster at it and faster, and then it would become second nature, just as all of the settings and features on the A1 have been. But I still find myself struggling a bit with the Leica because I'm just not used to getting through those controls in that way. Another thing that is a struggle for me with the Leica quite often is that if I am pointing the camera at something, it is showing me, it's brightening the screen, and it's showing me the scene. This is not the camera settings that I have selected. And so I'm at 1/125th of a second, and I'm at f2.0. So even if I switch it over to an ISO 200. So if I was to take this picture, this would not be properly exposed. If I press the shutter button down a little bit, things get darker. You can see that things got darker. And if I take the picture and then go and play back the image, it's actually completely dark. Like that is underexposed significantly. Now, I don't see anything on the meter here either, so that's probably telling me that it's either in one direction or the other, but it's not telling me what direction things are in. I don't have anything here that says like -3 or an arrow pointing that's saying things are super underexposed. So if I'm in an automatic mode on anything, whether it's automatic aperture, automatic shutter, or automatic ISO, I don't have an appropriate preview. Now, of course, I do have the histogram here if you choose to have that displayed, and it's still not really giving me exactly what I need. So if I was to take this picture and hit playback, that's actually properly exposed, or it's pretty close to properly exposed. So the histogram isn't really even going to save me there. The histogram is showing me the overall scene. It's not really giving me an idea of what's actually properly exposed and what's not. So I'm going to have to figure this out on my own. Now, if I do go into full manual, so say I'm at F2, and you can see I'm at F2 and I'm at a 30th, 1/30th, and so things are a little shaky, and it's showing me that I'm probably going to have an issue here. And as I change my shutter speed a little bit, the shakiness or the stutteriness goes away. So it's actually giving me a preview of what to expect. Like, hey, if you take this picture, it might be a little blurry because of your shutter speed. But now that I am at 1/125th, F2, and ISO 6400, if I take this picture, it's going to be better exposed, and you can see that's pretty good. But what I'm seeing here still is the same exposure that I would have if I was in one of these automatic modes. And when I press the shutter button down, things get dark again. And then you can see that I'm actually getting metering now. You can see that I'm maybe one stop down on my exposure. And so let's actually compensate for that, maybe by going up to 12,500. Now let's see. Oh, still goes down. So when I press down the shutter, things still get dark. And then when I take the picture and look at the picture, there's things with the Leica that you have to learn, that you have to understand, that maybe what you see on the screen is not necessarily what you're going to get. And so you have to really learn this system and understand how it works, because it works different than the Sony. Now let's go over to the Sony and kind of attempt the same thing. I'm going to put this in manual shooting mode. Actually, let's go to essentially what we were in first with the Leica. So let's actually go into shutter priority mode, which means that I'm going to have control over the shutter and the camera's going to have control over the aperture. Now, if I press down the shutter button a little bit, I'm getting a quick little preview so the camera can focus. So it's lightening everything up, and then it's taking me back to what I can expect as far as a photo. Now I'm at 1/60th, so if I go down maybe to, let's go to 1/125th, and then let's take it up to whatever ISO we're going to need to get us exposed. So now I'm zeroed out on the meter, so things are looking good. If I go a little bit brighter and then come back, you can see that the f-stop is adjusting now, f3.2, and so it's compensating. I don't need to go to 12,800. I could probably get away with 6,400. And you can see this is blinking because it says you're at the widest aperture. I want to go a little bit lower, but I can't. And so let's just go to 8,000, and this should be okay. So let's go ahead and take that picture and look at what we got there. So I got the image that it was exactly what I was expecting to get on the back of this camera. Now, if I go into manual mode and I press down the shutter a little bit, I'm getting the same thing. You can see when I press down, it's giving me a little bit of a metering. It's saying, hey, this might be 0.3 underexposed, and so maybe I want to go down with the shutter speed just a little bit to make sure that that's zeroed out. But you can see, like, nothing is happening on the back of this camera that's going to lead me to maybe be a little bit confused. I'm just going to hit that button, and I'm getting the image that I expected to get. So for me, the Leica has just taken a little bit more time getting used to, because I know that though it's doing whatever it's doing for a reason, I have to think a little bit ahead of the camera, whereas the Sony kind of gets out of the way for me and gives me exactly what I would expect to get. And that's kind of nice having that with the Sony. Now I've been shooting with these cameras with some different filters at times as well. I have a set of the Short Stash Everyday filter, which I think is absolutely great. It's a polarizer, so a circular polarizer with a little bit of black mist, a quarter black mist. And it's just a great filter. I love the style that it produces. Of course, I could get the style that Black Mist adds in Lightroom if I did that with my editing, but the polarizer is great. Whenever I'm shooting outdoors, I typically have a polarizer on, and having a little bit of Black Mist built in is great as well. So I've been shooting with that on the Leica because it has a 49mm filter thread, and I have a 49mm set of those filters as well. So let's take a look at some of the images that I captured. Let's grab the laptop here and let's take a look at some of these images. Let's try and do some side-by-sides here. So we'll go side by side with these images, and let's see which images we're actually looking at, because they both look really good. Looking at the image on the left, that is the Leica, and the image on the right is the Sony. And you can see I had the 40mm f2.5G here. So let's go to the center log here. This is what I had in focus. So the focus point was on the center. And you can really see that the Sony was sharper. So the Sony was sharper in this instance. And as we kind of pan across the image, you might be thinking, oh, maybe the Leica didn't have, the focus point wasn't in the right spot. I can't say that that is the truth. And I've had this instance across many images that I've shot with the Leica, which goes counter to what a lot of other people have experienced in shooting with the Leica. They experience extremely sharp images, and there are a lot of times when I get really sharp images with the Leica, but it's often that the Sony just has an overall sharper image. Now, these images are edited, but they have been edited the exact same way. So if we go to original on both of these, let's just go to original. You can see when I look at them side by side, still the same, sharper over here on the image from the Sony and less sharp over on the image from the Leica. So let's go and switch to a couple of other images. We've got this shot of the fire. And so if we go side by side here and look at these, the rendering of the fire, that's always challenging. So here we've got this log here and we've got fire surrounding it. And there's bigger, like blown out highlight areas in the Leica than there is with the Sony. But I don't know, if I look at both of these images, I kind of like the fire from the Leica a little bit better. But I don't know. Overall, you could see this image is a bit more blue in the background. So the Leica really leaned into the color temperature of the fire, whereas the Sony didn't do that as much. And yeah, the Sony was a little bit wider, so maybe it had a little bit more of an area. It wasn't as close, but I don't know. I mean, the Sony definitely did an overall better job with the color. The Leica definitely went quite a bit warmer with that. And if we actually look at the color temperature that the Leica chose, we could see 4050 for the white balance, and we could see 5000 for the Sony. And so the Sony chose a much warmer tone for that image than the Leica did. Let's choose the image of, I don't know what these things are called, but I basically just decided to kind of shoot through this. The sunset was back here, and I was shooting, I think, at a pretty wide aperture. If we look at that, we have f2.0 on the Leica. Oh, the Leica's over on the right side this time, and the Sony's over on the left side. And the Sony was at f2.5. So we were at a wide open aperture. I do like the Leica image. There's a bit more almost like vignetting that's taking place here on this image. If we look closely, it was hard to get a focal point that was consistent just because of how much is going on here. But if we look at the same reads, I guess is probably what these are, you can see that the Leica just chose a better focal point there. You can see in the background here, there's something weird happening with the Sony. You can see there's almost some like weird processing or something going on. There's like a line across here, which is really odd. You can't see it unless you get in super close, but you can see like a weird line going on here. And I don't know if that's something that happened with the processing of the file. You can also see just how muddy the background is here. Just doesn't look good. The background fall off on the Leica is just beautiful. And so whatever happened on this image, I don't know if it was some sort of processing. It almost looks like there was issues with the processing of this image, as it looks like a digital mess in comparison to the Leica. And so the Leica really just destroyed the Sony as far as the quality of that image. And if we look around here, you can even see just things that are out of focus on the Leica. I mean, look how good that is. And then look how jagged and gross that is. There's just so many abnormalities with this image that makes me think that something happened with the image on the Sony. Like, I really just don't know what happened there. But I don't have more than one image with the Sony to compare. I took a couple of images with the Leica of that same spot, one image with the Sony. All right, let's select this Leica image here and this Sony image here and do the side-by-side, which probably should put our Leica image back on the left, our Sony image over on the right. And so if we zoom in here, you can see the focal point was this kind of wooden bridge walkway. If we look at the colors, you can see definitely both cameras chose different colors. I was at a wide open aperture again on both of these. This was getting later into the evenings. If we look at the color temperature chosen for the Leica image, we're at 5,150 and then 5,500 on the Sony. And so you can see that the Leica is choosing cooler tones than the Sony. Both of these cameras had the same filter on the lens for this image. And so same issues going on here. So the main differences with these images is that one of them I shot, just a little bit lower with the Sony than with the Leica. And the Leica image, I think, is just overall a better looking image. Let's kind of keep going and try to speed things up here a little bit. If we grab this image and this image side by side, let's take a look. And so I have to say, like, both of these images look pretty good. We have the Leica image over on the left-hand side. So Leica on the left, Sony on the right. The Leica definitely, I don't like the background as much on the Leica. If we look to the background, you can see we've got blurry trees back here, but I like the coloring of the trees and everything in the background from the Sony. I don't like the rendering here of it. It looks a bit jagged and everything looks a bit smoother, even though it's more out of focus over here. Obviously, and I wasn't shooting wide open on either of these. I'm at f4 on the Leica and f4.5 on the Sony. So that could definitely be why the trees in the background on the Leica were a little bit more blurry, just because of the wider aperture. But if we look up close here, in the coloring and the rendering, you can see the Sony did a much better job this time. All of this just kind of blends together with the Leica, and I can't really see a whole lot of detail here. And also the focal point was a little bit different. If we're kind of looking at these posts here, I tried to get in the same position. I had the focal point set to the center, and I just let the camera choose, and the Sony chose... And the Sony seemed to do a little bit better job of choosing a focal point overall. And there's more detail here. And it might have to do just with the settings that the camera chose. But with the Sony, I'm at 1/125th, 4.5 f-stop, and ISO 200. With the Leica, I'm at 1/125th, 4.0, ISO 800. And so I am a bit brighter on the Leica, and that could be part of the reasoning here. I was shooting full manual, and this is a classic example of the struggle with the Leica of really just knowing what I'm going to get, because it does take a little bit longer for me with the Leica to identify what's exposed, what am I going to get, because the preview that the camera is giving me isn't exactly what I'm going to get when I press down the shutter button and take an image. So I definitely end up with more inconsistencies with the Leica, and that probably comes down to just needing more practice with the camera, not necessarily an issue with the camera itself. Now, this particular image, I think the Leica image definitely looks a lot better, and this is more of a exposure choice here. With the Leica, this one's maybe a little bit underexposed, but I'm at 1/125th, f5.6, and ISO 200, and with the Sony, I'm at 1/250th, 2.5, and ISO 100. So a big difference there between the settings that I had, and that definitely contributes to the image looking different, with the sky and the sun in the background being much more blown out. It took away from the warm tones that were back there that obviously I was able to capture with the Leica, likely because I was underexposed a little bit with the Leica image. So let's go back a couple days to some travel and do some side-by-side again and take a look at these images. So on the right-hand side, we've got the Leica this time, and we've got the Sony over on the left. And let's look at the detail on the side of this old train car and just kind of look at the fall off here. With the Leica, I am enjoying the fall off much better. Obviously, the focal point was back here, kind of in the middle. And so you can just see the fall off of the focus go right down the train car, and it just looks nice and smooth and a nice gradient of fall off, not only in exposure just because of the lighting and everything, but also the sharpness as we just look down. If we go to the edges here, things just look a bit muddier here. There's like some odd highlights and stuff like that that the camera just couldn't ignore. And with the Leica, it muted those a bit. It wasn't as abrupt, and there's nothing really distracting there. The fall off is just really good. And as we kind of look through some of the other details here, the colors on both of these look really good. Both images, both cameras did a pretty good job, but it does look a little bit better on the Leica over here, just looking at the board and the details on something that's a bit darker. And then if we look over on the other side of the train and look down the side of the train, I really just like the fall off of focus a lot better as well, or the fall on, I guess you'd say, as you take your eye and draw it out towards the center. That gradient is just better. You can see we've got a deeper focus here, and this probably, like, we've got f4 over here and we've got f2.5 over here, so that definitely plays a part. I was trying to go for proper exposure in both of these cameras. You can't just set the same settings on both of them. So I probably should have gone with a consistent aperture, but like I said, the Leica is just a bit more challenging, and I didn't want to spend all day fussing with it, especially as I'm trying to get these comparison images. So I just went with what seemed to be a good, proper exposure. So with all of that to say about these cameras and my experience with them, which is the better camera? Now, you can't really compare these exactly the same way because they're two different cameras. The Leica is designed to do a specific thing, and it has some great features, whereas the Sony is designed to do a lot of different things, and you can adapt it to do pretty much anything. But when it comes to looking at price, a Sony A1 with a decent lens is going to be about the same price as a Q3-43. So what would you choose? Well, it really comes down to what kind of flexibility you're going to need and whether or not you have other cameras. So if you are a hobbyist who's looking to step things up and get a really nice camera for going out and capturing images, you find yourself taking an image, being very thoughtful and methodical about the images that you take, and not needing to just go and rapid fire and take a bunch of images. You want to slow down and take one image here, one image there, and be much more thoughtful. The Leica Q3-43 is going to be a great option for you. Now, I have another video where I did a comparison between the Leica Q3-43 and the Leica Q3, so definitely check that out if you're conflicted as to which one to choose. Now, if you're wanting a camera for professional shooting, I definitely couldn't do what I do professionally with the Leica Q3. While it's a great camera to pull out and grab a couple of shots, maybe get a little bit more artistic and thoughtful with the shots that I'm capturing, I can't capture quick and dirty and get things done fast with anything else other than the Sony A1. The Sony A1 is fast. The autofocus is quick. The settings, customizing this camera, and just using it is quick. It is a camera that is designed to get the job done. The Leica Q3-43 is designed to enjoy photography and the experience of photography. So you can't put these cameras in the same class in that way. And I wouldn't choose the Leica Q3 for professional work unless I had a ton of time to think about my shots and spend time methodically putting my shots together, which I don't often have that luxury. And so the A1 is a camera that I always end up going to. Even when I have other Sony cameras at my disposal, like the Sony A7C, the C2 or the CR, those cameras are great, but they're just not as fast or as flexible as the Sony A1. And so the Sony A1 is by far the best camera that you can get for shooting professionally because it's so quick. There are camera controls for everything. It's customizable, and the camera is meant to be fast so that you could be reactive. The Q3 is not meant for that. The Q3 is meant to be slow and thoughtful and allow you to connect with the moment and the image that you're capturing so that it could produce a fantastic image. There's no way that you'll ever be able to do with the Q3 what you can do with the A1. But if you're like me and you want to enjoy photography for the simple fact of photography itself and be very connected to the shots that you're taking, you have to slow yourself down and change your mindset to get that kind of enjoyment out of a Sony like the Sony A1. And I think that's the confliction that a lot of photographers have that are out there making videos who shoot professionally with Sonys and other cameras, but like to go out and enjoy photography with a Leica. And you can either have the mindset of slowing down, thinking about your shots, thinking about your environment and everything that's going on around you, and being very methodical about the settings that you choose, maybe even the lens or whatever else it is that you're choosing to include in the shot. And you can do that with a Sony, but you have to get out of the mindset of this is a fast reactive camera where I can take a shot, boom, 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 fast autofocus. Everything is there with this camera. I have to get myself out of that mindset if I want to enjoy photography with the Sony A1. The Leica Q3 43 forces you to do that. It forces you to slow down because it's not a fast camera and it's not meant to work in that type of environment. And so you can either have that mindset yourself and do the work to put yourself in a correct place with the right expectations, slow yourself down, use your Sony and take some amazing images. And then when you need to be fast and reactive, go out and capture in burst mode and do whatever you need to do, spray and pray with your camera. You can do that. But if you need something to slow you down, to connect you to your photography, the Leica is a great camera for that. When looking at all of these images, yeah, there are differences. There are differences in the settings. There are differences in the fact that this is a more budget lens on a flagship camera, whereas this is a flagship camera and a flagship lens together. Yeah, there were little things, little intricacies there. But is this $7,000, almost $7,000 here in the US worth of benefits over the Sony A1, which I already own? No, it just isn't. I can instead choose to take a step back and relax, take a deep breath, grab my Sony A1 and capture images and get the images that I desire, knowing that I can switch lenses and do anything that I want to get the type of photo, whether it be a landscape or a portrait or a detail shot or something like that, which can be a bit more challenging with the Leica because you have the fixed lens. So in conclusion, both of these cameras really are perfect in what they were designed to do. The Leica is perfect in its ability to capture amazing images at 43 millimeter. Definitely having that macro mode is absolutely fantastic. The app experience when connecting the Leica to my iPhone is probably one of the best experiences of a connected camera to phone experience that there is. But there's definitely limitations with the Leica depending on what it is that I'm trying to shoot. Whereas the Sony is fast. The Sony is amazing at what it does. It's very adaptable. There are very few limitations with the Sony, but I have to be more mindful of what it is that I'm trying to capture and slow myself down so that I can enjoy photography like I used to. Unless I'm shooting for clients and things are happening quickly and I need to be fast, and then the Sony can do that as well. So both of these cameras are really amazing at doing exactly what it is that they were created to do. Mindful camera over here, adaptable, do everything camera over here. If you have the budget to have one of each, great, do that. But if you don't and you're choosing one camera, consider what it is that you're wanting to capture, the type of responsiveness you need out of your camera. I hope that this video helped you decide which camera maybe to choose. They are very expensive, but they're very amazing cameras, and they're both going to do a good job for you if you put yourself in the right place, if you align your expectations accordingly. Check out the links in the description below. I talked about shooting manually. If you want to learn manual mode, I have a free course for you called Ditch Auto. That's also linked down in the description. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you back in another one soon. Take care.